SG radar played a crucial role in the second phase of the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, which took place on November 14th to 15th, 1942. Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee was considered one of the sharpest minds in the Navy. Even though some critics made harsh remarks about him, Lee's technical skills and ability to make quick decisions under pressure set him apart from many officers of his generation. Between the wars, Lee served as the director of fleet training and was a strong supporter of modernizing and improving American warships. He became an expert in radar and its use in maritime operations. It was often said that Lee knew more about radar than even the operators themselves. His confidence in this mysterious and still mostly untested technology would prove vital on the night of November 14th to 15th, 1942, near Guadalcanal. Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, commander of the South Pacific Theater, sent Admiral Lee and his six-ship task force to Guadalcanal to prevent another Japanese attack on Henderson Field. Just a day earlier, Admiral Daniel J. Callahan's group of cruisers and destroyers had stopped a Japanese assault, but suffered heavy losses, including the death of Callahan himself and the sinking of 6 ships. The battered survivors were in no shape to resist another attack. As the commander of Task Force 64, which consisted of the battleships South Dakota and Washington, along with 4 destroyers, Admiral Lee was given the job of halting the enemy bombardment force. On November 14th, a Japanese reconnaissance plane spotted Task Force 64 moving roughly 100 miles south of Guadalcanal, heading north. Mistaking the battleships for cruisers, the pilot misidentified the American ships. At about the same time, a Japanese force under Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo was making its way toward Guadalcanal. Around 4:30 p.m., the American submarine Flying Fish encountered Kondo's group and fired several torpedoes at the cruiser Otago. Though none of the torpedoes struck, Flying Fish delivered valuable intelligence to the U.S. forces, giving them important details about Kondo's movements. Admiral Lee now knew that he would face a large enemy force. Lee's task group, headed toward the western shoreline of Guadalcanal, organized itself with 4 destroyers in the lead, followed by the battleships South Dakota and Washington. Admiral Halsey had given Lee the freedom to arrange his forces as he thought best. Knowing the enemy would approach from the northwest, Lee positioned his ships between Cape Esperance and Savo Island. This gave him a strategic advantage, but it was tempered by the fact that Lee had never worked with the destroyers in his group before. Each destroyer came from a different division, and they were chosen simply because they had more fuel. It was also the first time that the 2 battleships operated together. Only a day had passed since the 6 ships had joined forces. Lee ordered a 5,000-yard separation between the destroyers and the battleships to reduce the risk of accidents in the narrow waters of Guadalcanal. Around 9 p.m. on November 14th, Lee commanded his force to change direction by 90 degrees, passing Savo Island and entering Iron Bottom Sound. Before the war, the area was simply known as Savo Sound, but after the heavy losses of ships during the campaign for Guadalcanal, sailors renamed it Iron Bottom Sound. Lee knew the enemy was near, but needed more up-to-date information. His task group had left the naval station at Espiritu Santo without a proper radio call sign. When he tried to contact the forces on Guadalcanal, known by the call sign Cactus, they responded coldly, saying they did not recognize him. Lee, trying again, identified himself by reminding them that General Alexander Vandegrift, commander of the 1st Marine Division and an old friend from the Naval Academy, was with him and needed information. Lee's nickname at the academy was Ching Lee. When communication was still difficult, Lee sent playful but urgent coded messages that only Vandegrift would recognize. One such message, sent as a rhyming couplet, read, "This is Ching Lee, you mustn't fire fish at me," referring to torpedoes. Another attempt simply told the PT boats to inform their boss that it was Ching Lee. His colorful messages succeeded in convincing the American PT boats that his battleships were friendly, preventing them from mistakenly attacking his force. However, Lee still received no further updates on the Japanese fleet's movements. After 10:30 p.m., the reply from Guadalcanal's defenders was brief. There was no additional information. While Lee was busy trying to confirm friendly communication, Admiral Kondo split his force into 3 groups. A column of 6 destroyers led by the light cruiser Nagara moved in one direction, while another group consisting of the light cruiser Sendai and 3 destroyers headed east of Savo Island. Kondo's main bombardment force, including his flagship heavy cruiser Atago, her sister ship Takao, and the battleship Kirishima, continued toward Henderson Field, with 9 destroyers and 4 troop transports also moving toward Guadalcanal. Kondo planned for Kirishima and the bombardment group to shell Henderson Field, while the transports landed reinforcements for the Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal. Any American ships that surfaced to interfere with the bombardment group or the landing of reinforcements would be handled by the other 2 groups of cruisers and destroyers. On paper, the plan seemed solid. At 10:10, Sendai made the first contact with Lee's forces. She spotted 2 enemy cruisers and 4 destroyers northeast of Savo, heading toward Iron Bottom Sound. Admiral Kondo ordered an immediate attack on the American ships. Sendai and Shikanami changed course to pursue them, while Nagara, along with 4 destroyers, was sent at full speed toward Iron Bottom Sound. Meanwhile, Kondo would move Kirishima and 2 heavy cruisers to bombard Henderson Field, leaving his destroyers and cruisers to engage the Americans. At 10:52, Lee reached the southernmost point of his Guadalcanal course and ordered his 6 ships to turn westward. Washington's SG radar picked up Sendai around 8 minutes after it changed direction, finding it 9 miles to the north. By 11:12, the main battery fire control director made visual contact, with radar still tracking the ship. South Dakota also spotted Sendai, but the Japanese cruiser managed to avoid direct sight from the American destroyers. Admiral Lee gave the command to open fire when ready, 4 minutes after radar contact. Thanks to the new SG radar, which proved far superior to the older SC radar, Washington had a major advantage. The SC radar had been installed on U.S. ships in late 1941, just before Pearl Harbor, but it had many flaws. Some senior officers believed SC transmissions gave away ship positions to Japanese operators, who could use them to find American ships. There were no such concerns with the SG radar, which operated on shorter waves and didn't reveal positions. Even officers unfamiliar with radar knew SG was a big improvement. At 11:17, about 17 minutes after first radar contact, Washington fired her 16-inch guns at Sendai and her escorts. Her 5-inch guns fired star shells to light up the Japanese ships, even though they were still 18,000 yards to the north. The heavy rounds landed near the Japanese ships, but did not hit. South Dakota's radio operators could hear frantic Japanese communications. Soon after, Shikanami hid behind a smokescreen, and Sendai's commander, Shintaro Hashimoto, turned his group northward. Despite the smoke, Washington's radar continued tracking the Japanese destroyers Uranami and Ayanami, who were still heading south toward the Americans. At 11:23, the destroyer USS Walker, leading Lee's column, fired her 5-inch guns. Benham and Preston also opened fire, described as rapid and continuous. Walker soon found herself facing the destroyer screen protecting the cruiser Nagara. 4 minutes after Walker opened fire, she engaged in what was later called a private gun duel with the Japanese destroyers. The Japanese quickly responded. Preston was hit several times by Nagara and other destroyers, knocking out her boiler room and bringing down her rear smokestack. Her aft gun stations were surrounded by burning wreckage. More shells, likely from Nagara, smashed into her engine room. Though the gunnery officer tried to keep the forward guns firing, Preston was sinking fast, settling by the stern and listing to starboard. At 11:36, about 14 minutes after Walk opened fire, the order was given to abandon ship. Survivors reported that Preston capsized and sank less than a minute later. About 3,000 yards away, sailors aboard USS Gwin watched as Japanese shells slammed into their sister ship. Gwin had to turn sharply to avoid colliding with the sinking wreck. The gray background of Savo Island helped the Japanese ships remain hidden, and their flashless gunpowder also made their positions harder to detect. The Japanese soon unleashed their deadliest weapon, the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo. It was a devastating weapon, measuring 30 feet long and 24 inches in diameter with a 1,180-pound warhead. It could travel 22,000 yards, or about 11 nautical miles at a speed of 49 knots. By comparison, the U.S. Navy's Mark 14 torpedo carried an 825-pound warhead and could only go 6,000 yards at 45 knots. Running on pure oxygen instead of compressed air, the Long Lance produced almost no visible wake, making it harder to spot and dodge. Mounted in 24-inch tubes on deck, these torpedoes could be reloaded quickly, allowing Japanese ships to fire many more at once. At 11:30 p.m., the destroyer Ayanami fired her Long Lance torpedoes. 5 minutes later, other Japanese ships launched theirs. USS Washington was hit around 11:38, likely by a torpedo from Ayanami. The explosion, combined with the detonation of her forward magazines, ripped the ship apart, blowing everything forward of the bridge into the sea. Walkie sank bow first, losing all power and communications. Her depth charges exploded underwater as she went down, killing many survivors. Benham was hit by another torpedo that smashed the forward part of her hull. Although she stayed afloat, she had to slow down to 10 knots and maneuver carefully. Benham had also taken 3 shell hits, but remained operational. USS Gwin avoided torpedoes by turning away from Preston's wreck. One hit broke her torpedo safety links, but the torpedoes slipped into the sea without exploding. Meanwhile, Washington opened fire on the Japanese destroyer Ayanami, hitting her many times and setting her ablaze. Ayanami's gunfire had revealed her position, as the muzzle flashes stood out clearly against Savo Island's dark outline. Her sister destroyers fared better, as their reloaded torpedoes kept them in the fight, and none had taken serious damage. Admiral Lee's 4 destroyers did not have such good fortune. Benham and Gwin were badly damaged but still afloat, while Preston and Walker were both sunk. Though they suffered greatly, they had fulfilled their mission by shielding the 2 battleships from enemy fire and torpedoes. At around 11:48, Admiral Lee ordered Benham and Gwin to withdraw from the battle zone. Now, only the battleships remained. However, South Dakota soon faced what many would later call a stroke of bad luck. Even before the 2 destroyers left the area, the battleship suffered a massive electrical failure. The ship's circuit breakers tripped, causing all the lights to go out and all radar screens to go dark in an instant. Captain Thomas L. Gatch of the South Dakota crew noted that the psychological effect on the officers and crew was deeply depressing, though he tried to play it down. The battleship's lights were out for just 6 minutes, from 11:30 to 11:36. When power was restored, the radar operators discovered that their radar picture was incomplete. Although radar was back, it was not working at full capacity. Without this crucial equipment, everyone felt as if they were blindfolded. According to the official damage report, the SG radar was inoperative, making it harder to keep station and detect new targets. To make things worse, South Dakota had steered to starboard instead of port to avoid colliding with Preston and Walker, which accidentally placed her directly in the path of the Japanese warships and the burning American destroyers. Now darkened by the surrounding flames, South Dakota became an easier target for Japanese gunners and torpedo crews. Admiral Kondo's bombardment force discovered an enemy destroyer at less than 3 miles distance, according to the shocked radar operators. South Dakota remained unseen by Kondo until 11:58. Once they spotted her, many of Kondo's ships, especially Asagao, targeted the battleship, firing torpedoes and turning their searchlights on her. The Japanese lookouts now clearly recognized South Dakota as a battleship. Earlier, they had mistakenly described her as a cruiser. But with the searchlights shining on her massive superstructure and towering foremast, there was no longer any doubt. Although all the torpedoes missed, the gunfire certainly did not. South Dakota took 26 hits in less than 4 minutes, just after midnight. According to the ship's gunfire report, there were at least 1 5-inch hit, 6 6-inch hits, 18 8-inch hits, and 1 14-inch hit. Another report stated that the ship's armor withstood 2 14-inch shells, but suffered heavy damage topside from 6-inch and 5.5-inch shells. Some of the shells failed to explode, while those that did made a loud crashing noise, followed by a rolling explosion and the sizzling sound of metal fragments smashing into cables, guns, and the superstructure, as described by a sailor on board. The official report concluded that South Dakota had suffered only superficial damage despite the many hits. However, Kirishima's assistant gunnery officer saw it differently, believing that South Dakota had been struck many times and seriously damaged. Damage control teams worked amid devastation across every department, fighting fires, making emergency repairs, and gathering the 39 bodies of their fellow crew members. Once it was clear that South Dakota could no longer support Admiral Lee in stopping Kondo's bombardment, Captain Gatch requested permission to withdraw. Admiral Lee granted his approval just after midnight on the morning of November 15th. After South Dakota exited the area, Washington was left to face Kondo's battleships alone. Historian Samuel Eliot Morrison described Washington as having become a lone ship task force, which should have placed Admiral Lee and his flagship in serious danger. However, the Japanese lookouts had become so focused on South Dakota that they seemed to ignore Washington, which was only 8,400 yards away. South Dakota, brightly lit by searchlights and already heavily damaged, drew the full attention of Kondo's forces. One observer noted that there was a general rush among the Japanese to target the illuminated South Dakota. Realizing his fortunate position, Admiral Lee prepared to launch a full assault on Kirishima, the leader of Kondo's battleship force. The battle between Washington and Kirishima resembled a clash between two heavyweight boxers in a darkened ring. A British writer once romantically described the battle between the German battleship Bismarck and the battlecruiser HMS Hood as a medieval joust, with guns instead of lances and armored bridges instead of visors. Washington held a significant advantage thanks to her SG radar. One of her 5-inch guns also fired a star shell to light up Kirishima and improve visual targeting. Even though Washington's radar provided a clear image of the enemy, her operators faced a tricky situation. South Dakota was hidden in the starboard quarter's radar blind spot. As a result, Washington could not see her sister ship on the radar screens. Admiral Lee hesitated to fire, concerned he might accidentally target South Dakota. Once it was confirmed that South Dakota was safely accounted for, Lee gave the order to fire. At precisely midnight, all 9 of Washington's 16-inch guns and 2 of her 5-inch mounts opened fire on Kirishima, while 2 more 5-inch turrets fired at Otago. The battleship's gunnery officer later reported that Washington fired at a target 8,400 yards away, identifying it as a Congo-class battleship. Washington's shells were armor-piercing rounds, designed to penetrate Kirishima's decks and explode inside the ship. In contrast, Kondo's ships were firing high-explosive shells intended to destroy airfield facilities at Henderson Field and kill soldiers, not to engage enemy battleships. This mismatch in ammunition types limited the damage South Dakota suffered. Washington's shells flew at Kirishima at over 2,600 feet per second. The flash from Washington's guns must have been terrifying for Kirishima's crew, who knew that massive American shells were hurtling toward them in less than a minute. Giant white water plumes erupted all around Kirishima, reaching high over the ship's superstructure. Kirishima was soon obscured by the explosions. Not every shell was a near miss. The gunnery officer wrote that Washington likely scored a hit with her first salvo and definitely with the second. Kirishima suffered multiple hits from 16-inch and 5-inch shells. Her steering gear was jammed, fires broke out all over her superstructure and deep within her hull, and flooding spread through many compartments below the waterline. 2 of Kirishima's main gun turrets were also knocked out. The gunnery officer of Washington noted that both overs and shorts could be seen optically, and that the salvos were carefully walked back and forth across the target. Radar played a crucial role in Washington's excellent shooting. For at least 5 minutes, radar exclusively guided the targeting of the secondary battery. Admiral Lee, a longtime champion of radar, was thrilled with this result. When visual contact was eventually established, the checks confirmed that the radar had been precisely on target, proving all Lee's earlier claims about this remarkable technology that allowed gun crews to see and strike targets in any weather and even in darkness. A naval historian described how Kirishima was knocked out of the battle within just 7 minutes. Her topsides were engulfed in flames, and her steering was hopelessly wrecked. Kirishima's assistant gunnery officer later provided a detailed account of the desperate situation aboard the stricken battleship. He said the steering of the Kirishima was so badly damaged that they could not steer or fix it. Shortly after the American ships opened fire, they kept going in circles, unable to escape. They tried to steer by adjusting the engines, but it didn't work. The ship took about 45-inch shells and around 9 16-inch shell hits from the Washington. He added that while the engines were not completely destroyed, the ship kept getting hit by Washington's big 16-inch guns and smaller 5-inch batteries. Washington stopped firing exactly 7 minutes after starting its attack, which was 7 minutes past midnight. Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison's evaluation agreed with the Kirishima's assistant gunnery officer. Around 45-inch shells and 9 16-inch shells from Washington hit the battleship. Even though Kirishima was out of the fight, Admiral Kondo's bombardment group was still a strong force. Around 6 destroyers from Kondo's 2 support groups were still positioned west of Savo Island, along with the cruisers Atago, Takao, Nagara, and Sendai. However, Kondo was concerned about the safety of his transports. He ordered a lighter bombardment of Henderson Field and sent several destroyers to attack Washington. About 13 minutes after Washington stopped firing at Kirishima, the American battleship moved north-northwest. Admiral Kondo was determined to keep Washington from interfering with his troop landings. Around 12:40 a.m., the destroyer Oyashio fired torpedoes at Washington, followed closely by another ship, Sazanami, which launched long-lance torpedoes about 6 minutes later. The cruiser Atago also fired 3 torpedoes. Some torpedoes came dangerously close, but none hit. Seeing that his plan to take down Washington was unlikely to succeed, Kondo decided it was no longer practical to stay near Savo Island. At 12:45 a.m., he ordered all ships to retreat after firing their torpedoes and any ship not involved in the attack to evacuate. Kondo's bombardment group pulled back behind a thick smoke screen around 12:35 a.m. Admiral Morrison noted that Admiral Lee watched this withdrawal with satisfaction. As a final act, 2 Japanese warships, Oyashio and Kagero, fired torpedoes toward Washington before retreating. Some torpedoes exploded as they passed through Washington's wake turbulence, but they did not hit the ship. Washington was the last American vessel to leave the battle area, about 15 minutes after South Dakota had withdrawn. Meanwhile, the damaged destroyer Benham was being escorted back to Espiritu Santo by the destroyer Gwyn. However, Benham was too badly damaged to complete the trip. Gwyn rescued Benham's crew in the afternoon of November 15th, and prepared to use torpedoes to sink the crippled ship. Although 4 torpedoes were launched, all either failed or missed. Eventually, Gwin had to use gunfire to sink Benham and made it safely back to Espiritu Santo. Washington also traveled to Espiritu Santo alongside South Dakota. Due to the heavy damage to her upper works, South Dakota was sent back to the United States for repairs and a complete overhaul. Benham and the Japanese destroyer Aonami shared similar fates, though Aonami didn't need to be scuttled. Around 2 in the morning, Aonami's crew was taken off, and the destroyer later sank. At this point, Kirishima was still afloat but barely moving and taking on water through shell holes under the waterline. The assistant gunnery officer recalled that the captain decided it would be better to scuttle the ship since they couldn't steer and the engines were damaged. He gave the order to open the Kingston valves, and Kirishima slowly sank west of Savo Island. The Emperor's portrait was transferred to the Asama, and it took about 2.5 hours for Kirishima to sink. Destroyers managed to rescue about 25% of the crew. The rest had to jump into the sea and were picked up later. At around 3:25 a.m. on November 15th, the Kirishima finally sank. Of the approximately 1,400 men on board, around 250 were lost. Almost 50 years later, in the summer of 1992, underwater explorer Robert Ballard found the wreck of Kirishima about 11 miles west of Savo Island. When he reached the seafloor, he found that the ship had capsized completely, and its superstructure was embedded in the mud. Only the bottom of the hull, the rudders, and the propellers were visible above the keel. The battleship had probably become top-heavy due to its large pagoda mast, which made it flip over. Ballard also noticed that Kirishima's bow had broken off, suggesting that an internal explosion had occurred after the sinking.